Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Shady Oak Ministries. We'll be reviewing the second episode in Season 1 of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. I am of course from Shady Oak, and because in this episode I just found so many important points that directly parallel to the life of Jesus, I just want to get right into it. I will be covering 7 major points that happened in the episode that I believe personally relate to, I think by no accident, the life of Jesus Christ, and by all intents and purposes, do directly confirm things that are applicable to today's world today. The first thing I want to talk about is, obviously, when the episode started, Twilight attempted a dangerous opportunity to go after the elements of harmony after a interesting library discovery by Pinkie Pie. Like she always does, we love her. Twilight wanted to do this whole thing alone. And as we talked about in the study on the element of magic, a topical one, you feel free to listen to it on your own time. But Twilight's calling, you would tell by her nature, it was sort of a hidden pride in knowing that her calling was just too much to expect from anyone other than herself. And with that in mind, Twilight wanted to do this on her own and went off on her own, but it was by that first initiative and example she got her friends to follow along with her. And as she went, the people who followed her, like on Facebook, her followers eventually became friends for her channel. Now, there's an interesting story about how Jesus first started off in his ministry following his baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River, and likewise after his temptation in the wilderness for 40 days. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 35 through 51. I won't be reading it verse by verse due to just respecting your guys' time, but I do encourage you to read this on your own time along with all the other verses that I'll be reading. But in the life of Jesus, the exact way that Twilight ended up gaining her friends is basically starting his earthly ministry was the disciples heard what had happened with Jesus, and they wanted to learn from him, follow him, and get to know him. A friendship was established not based off of his own boastings like Trixie would, but in this case, Jesus just said, I'm off to follow my calling. If you want to tag along, come and see. Jesus literally said, Master, where are you going? Verse 37. The 2 disciples followed him after hearing what happened with John the Baptist, and he's saying, what are you looking for? Where are you staying, teacher? He said, come and see. Just hang out. If you want to join me, I won't stop you. And he loved talking with people. You would know that eventually in Jesus' ministry he gathered a pretty large crowd and following of all the people who wanted to hear the things that he had to say. A lot of people revered him as a prophet. A lot of people just looked up to him as a spiritual leader. But the more he started to go into his claims of saying, I'm God, before Abraham was, I am, it kind of separated the wheat from the chaff. I'm not here for free food. I'm here to satisfy your souls. And all but the 12 left. Well, it really begged the question in considering who your real friends were as opposed to the background ponies when Twilight actually had the main 6 to hang on. They weren't there to gain something from her. They were there to learn from her and to join in the journey that she had set out to do, because that wasn't her, at first at least, that they wanted to get to know as a friend. It was following after the initiative of her calling. They admired that she was willing to go out and just obey the will of God, in this case, as Jesus would directly parallel. Now, there's also a funny thing I also want to note in the next chapter, right after he picked up most of his early disciples. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 of the Gospel of John, I really recommend you guys read it because it's, the famous story, Jesus turned the wine at a wedding feast into water. But in chapter 2, verse 1 through 11 is this whole story. But at verse 11, it said, this is the beginning of signs, the miracles, Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So how did these followers, as I said before, become Jesus' friends? They all went to a party. Make the comparison, Pinkie Pie through, you get it. I just think that's really funny. Not one of the major events, but something to consider. I think that was no accident, and it's just really funny. Anyway, event number 2. thing that happened after this, when they first entered the Everfree Forest, the group ended in a cliffside accident. No one really's fault. Rainbow Dash did try and pull off a little scare routine, but as far as just things happening in this life, it was a natural disaster. And they had to make grounds to make sure the people who couldn't fly could get across that obstacle, whether it would be through gravity being their downfall or their gain. Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy obviously caught Rarity and Pinkie Pie immediately, but leaving Applejack and Twilight at the mercy of a cliff, of course, Applejack expressed her element of honesty in direct comparison to this in saying that Twilight had to place all of her confidence in Applejack's word, even to the point of trusting her own life by just believing that Applejack knew something that she couldn't see at the moment. Now, Applejack knew that there were two Pegasi pony waiting with arms or hooves open the moment that she would let go. But of course, all that Twilight saw was a cliff. Well, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 22 through 25, some of you may know this story. Jesus wanted to go with his disciples to the other side of a river. And since this is just 3 verses, I'd be happy to just read it for you. It said, "Now that it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples," referring to Jesus, "and he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side of the lake.'" So Jesus' statement, just like Applejack's statement of honesty, that she'll be all right if she let go, Jesus told his disciples before anything happened that they were going to go to the other side of the lake. So they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." Now, note, this wasn't just, say, turbulent conditions as far as what you'd see on, I don't know, classic comparison, Deadliest Catch, where they just have to avoid the natural waves, but obviously the boat's in motion, and if you're not accustomed to this, you get sick. No, it was literally in some of the other accounts in the Gospels that water and the waves were breaking into the boat. So there's like starting to become an angle to this. They're taking their hats and their buckets and they're just trying to bail out water as quickly as they can. And Jesus is there sleeping. Now he had a rough day, but granted, with all the disciples just frantically trying to say, "And you said we would go to the other side of the lake. This was your idea, Lord." And he's tired. But they didn't trust his word in saying, "Hey, we're going to make it to the other side of the lake." But all they saw, just like with that cliff, was a natural disaster coming around them. But Jesus arose and rebuked the wind. Literally, he told it to put a lid on it. And the raging of the water, and they ceased. And there was a great calm. So literally, the storm all being thrown up. If you would go to the Sea of Galilee today, actually it's a region in somewhat northern Israel, the conditions there as far as the tropics are very interesting for Middle Eastern geography, because the Sea of Galilee is almost like a half bowl of mountains, which means there's a lot of cold air up in the mountains. But there's a huge downdrop where everything's just lush and at sea level on the Sea of Galilee. Even below sea level at some points, you would know the lower you go, the warmer it gets. So there's this literally a layer of hot and cold air that allows for a lot of stuff to be grown on the bottom. But just like when these cold winds blow through on the mountaintops and it mixes with the hot air, you get some pretty freak storms and some pretty intense ones that can develop really quickly. Where I live in the world, actually, I live right next to a mountain range in Arizona, which is the desert in the United States. And because we are used to a lot of hot air, when we reach the time in our season a little bit later into summer when it's really hot on the ground and it gets really cool up in the mountains, all it needs is just maybe like once every other week for a good wind to push in that cold air, and we get these things called monsoons, which are tropical storms for all intents and purposes. The lightning is just almost life-threatening. The downpours are, you get the idea. The disciples were in no fair strait any more than Twilight would have been hanging over a cliff saying, normally gravity's my friend, but in this case it could be my end. Applejack made the word and promise to Twilight and saying, look, I can make you this promise. You can trust my word for it, just like the element of honesty would. Jesus expressed his honesty and turned to them saying, where is your faith? They were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. Twilight didn't know that Applejack had the perspective of knowing that Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy had already gotten Rarity and Pinkie Pie to safety, just like the disciples didn't know at this point that of course the wind and waves would obey Jesus because they know the voice of their Creator. It really begs the question, though, when Jesus makes us a promise, how quickly, when things seem to physically get out of control, are we so quick to just abandon all attempts and notions when Jesus just says, trust me at my word. Know that I am honest. Know that I am faithful to my word. More emphasis on this in the element of honesty study. But again, being this is introducing all their character traits, you can get a lot more into this than what we really have time for. But I want to continue just leaving you with that. It's so cool how these comparisons were made. After, of course, the cliff incident, after nature had its little bout with them, the third event in the episode I want to discuss is the angry manticore that came up, copying a serious attitude. Now, I don't know much about manticores, but anything with a lion's head, dragon wings, and a scorpion tail probably seems dangerous and want to avoid it. Well, when it's charging at you, there's not much you can do than fight back. Well, the main six tried everything they had at their disposal to physically assault this thing, to overcome it by the means that they had responded to with any other creature before them. And naturally, Applejack, she trusted on Bucky's McGillicuddy and Kix McGee. Rarity even tried to take a snap at it. Twilight tried charging. Rainbow Dash, everyone messed up because they were trying these things in their own strength. But then it was when Fluttershy stepped in, and she had the heart and compassion to look for a separate issue than maybe just the manticore's attitude and wanting to understand what the deeper truth of the matter was. She found out there was a splinter that was making the thing angry. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verse 14 through 29, you can feel free to read this on your own time as well. It's a very, very sad situation in that there was a boy, after he was handed to the disciples, Jesus, in a few chapters back, had told the disciples that on his authority, they would be able to go out, being followers of him, to spread the word of the gospel and what he was sent to accomplish in the world, and that they would be able to prove signs to the world to back up what they were saying. They would be able to cast out demons, cure disease. Basically, the people of Israel were all about just knowing things confirmed from prophets by saying, well, is there any divine quality behind you to prove this? You know, we have stamps or signatures of approval from people who are in charge of a company, so if I can trust that your offer to give me $1 million in agreement with merging with your company, I would then be able to trust it because I have the headmaster, the CEO of the company's signature behind this, written by his hand, or be able to call him on the phone or something. It wasn't too much to ask for the people of Israel to want proof. But as the disciples were there performing all this miracles, you could imagine that just like most Olympians who became regular gold medalists, they started to get a little cocky, a little overconfident in saying, hey, bring it on. You got influenza? Bang, healed. You got a demonic possession? You guys hear like voices in your sleep? Bang. Well, there was a young boy who, in this case, was an epileptic, was prone to seizures. They go into some details about that in the passage. And, well, he in this case was demonically influenced because of the mental disorder, and along with these series of epilepsy, because it was a young boy, it's just really hard to imagine, especially when they brought him before Jesus and the demons saw Jesus, that he immediately went into convulsions and started frothing at the mouth. Jesus, unlike his disciples, tried to find a solution for this in saying that this kind cannot come out by nothing. This can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Now, definitely something the disciples never considered. They just said, hey, Jesus gave us permission. Now we have the authority of the divine. We have a prophet of God behind us. That's all we need. But no, healing should only be done in compassion. You know, saving people's lives, if it's only motivated by making yourself look good, for we as Christians, if we want to save people just because we can have like a little tally mark to say how many people we've led to salvation, and we're not doing it because God just loves that person and wants to see them live forever in his kingdom, then our motivations are all wrong. And just like when Fluttershy saw a manticore, furious, a dangerous and much stronger creature than a pony, literally tossing aside every attempt by the main six in physically overcoming that obstacle, Fluttershy had a heart of compassion, and just like Jesus said, you guys need to pray. You guys need to trust that God's going to do this in faith. Now that's something that we commonly overlook, just like splinters, because it hurts a lot, and yet it's so hard to see because we only focus on the physical, when in this case the issue was spiritual. You know, epilepsy, brain disorders, you can get into the debate as to what causes these things, but in this case it's specified that a deaf and dumb spirit, a demonic entity, was torturing this kid, and God healed him. But just like with Fluttershy, that manticore didn't do anything wrong in running through thorns or sticker bushes or punching a cactus, for crying out loud, to get that splinter. Sometimes the enemy just comes after people, and God can use other people to bring healing into their lives. But I want to emphasize on that point in this event, the third event in the series, we need to recognize that there's more going on than just the physical. And when we are faced with problems, it can do just as much good to pray as it would to seek the help of other people, because you start at the top and work your way down. It really gets on to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? You start from the inside, you clean the inside of your heart, and then your life starts to reflect your motivations. You clean up your desires before you start to clean up your behavior. You check your motivation before you start changing the way you do things. Anyone can do the right thing, but if it's for the right reasons, that's what's Fluttershy's heart of kindness, just like with Jesus. He loved that boy, and it pained him to see him suffer like that. It's a natural thing in this world, sadly. That's why God faced this stuff. That's why God came down to face it personally, to take it all on himself so that he can understand when we're suffering. So continuing. Fourth event, sea serpent. Canon name for him, actually, from the fan base has been known to call him Steve Magnet. Was in just complete misery over a problem that didn't seem to bother or affect anyone else but him. And Rarity took the time to not only meet, sympathize, and understand with this sea serpent, but even gave up her time and, in this case, her tail, to meet the need that no one else even cared to know. Something that may naturally have come back in time, but it was hurting him in the moment. Fashionable symmetry may not have been much an issue for the main six, but Rarity met the sea serpent's heart where he was at. He understood his character in more ways than one. And with this in mind, we also get a direct parallel of this in the life of Jesus. Again, back to the Gospel of John, right after the wedding feast where he turned the water into wine. Skipping one chapter after that, Jesus was going through an area which was north of Israel. Being a Galilean, it was basically in the northern region of Israel, and there were this group of people known as Samaritans, which historically were Jews who, after about 700 years BC, before Christ, Israel had fallen into a state of idolatry, and they were worshiping false and pagan gods in some of the most grotesque ways you could imagine. I don't want to go too much into it, but the deities Ashtaroth, Molech, Baal, it would have been, if they continued to assimilate that outside influence into their culture, the nation would have been wiped out. So God, being a loving father, disciplined Israel by bringing in the Assyrians, who were common practitioners of this idolatry, which would be, in this case, a stern reminder and saying, do you really want to go this route? Do you want to follow after these dudes? Because you can tell they're not heading in any good direction that you want to follow in. You would remember the book of Jonah. He was going to minister to he was going to offer forgiveness to the nation that was at Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and the northern 10 tribes of Israel were taken off in captivity. God allowed them to be overcome by this local enemy, and the Assyrians, to mess with a people's culture and prevent rebellion, what they would do is they would move all of the people groups out and then assimilate all of their people in so that they would lose their cultural identity, something that's been attempted on the Jewish people many times and failed. Well, the Samaritans were as much aesthetically Hebrews as much as the Jews in the southern 2 kingdoms, but the difference was that, along with all the Assyrians that had mixed with the Jewish culture, they were looked on kind of as half-breeds by the Jewish culture, because they were specified, God has promised a Messiah through a pure Jewish line, thus the grace has kind of departed from you. No, it wasn't the right thing to do. It wasn't in the Bible to treat people this way, but it was just given the common stereotype of that day to look down on the Samaritan people. And of all the people that Jesus was going to end up bumping into by himself was a Samaritan woman. Now, this woman was not only looked down upon in Hebrew culture back in those ancient days before Jesus had actually established and reignited respect and honor as we being all equal in the eyes of God, but on top of that, this woman had quite a history. She found satisfaction through her relationships, and not getting into too much details, she was well known for being an immoral person and being the Jewish people a very moralistic society, a very religious sort of social structure. She did not want to take any junk from anybody. She wanted to face any grief, so she even waited to go shopping, in this case, to go to a well to get water once everyone else had gone. Basically, she was the one who shopped at Walmart at 2 in the morning, okay? She didn't want to socially interact because she didn't want to have to deal with all of the social grief that she'd be taking because of her life choices. Her satisfaction was in the things of this world. And when she came to Jesus, he was waiting for her. And, again, in this whole event, basically Jesus has this conversation with her and asks her, right out, he speaks to her. He meets her where she's at. And she says, can you give me a drink? Because she's there to obviously get water. And she's kind of playing his bluff and saying, I have a lot of experience with men, so how am I going to play this card? She's saying, you're a Jew. Why do you want a drink from me? Almost flirting with him. And Jesus, once meeting her where she was at, and her being willing to at least speak with him, begins to build on that point. And he says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So the Samaritan woman was going to fish water out of a well, but Jesus was saying, I offer you ice-cold spring water. Not only water that, basically a water pail that not only never loses its satisfaction. It's always got a little bit of ice in it, so it's extra satisfying, something that in the American culture is often taken for granted. Those of you listening who live abroad, you would know that cold water is a really rare commodity, and it's a really nice thing. But on top of that, spring water doesn't come by digging into a reservoir underground. It's a constantly reflowing and refilling source of life, something that would motivate a city to be built around it because it was just so precious and so rare in the Middle East. Now, the woman's obviously kind of confused at this point. She's saying, where do you get this living water? You don't even have a bucket to fish in this well. And Jesus really got down to the heart of the issue and saying, whoever drinks this water will thirst again. I can relate to that. I drink a lot of water, being a resident of a desert region. And I continue to get thirsty because I need to constantly refill my bodily needs, because I'm constantly breaking down. My body's constantly using these resources to maintain itself. But Jesus said, whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. Now, Jesus wasn't saying, look, I'm going to cast magical enchantment on your water pail so that no matter how much water you pour out, it would just be infinitely refillable. It's a little cheat code for infinite ammo in your life in battle against your mortality. No, Jesus was speaking of a spiritual issue and saying, just like she said, I would love some of this water. Sir, give me some of this water. And Jesus said, okay, get your husband. The woman said, I have no husband. And he said, you're right, you've had 5 husbands, and the one that you currently live with is not your husband. Jesus, going down to the root of the issue, and in the rest of the chapter, he tells her more into detail about how honoring God in a relationship is far more satisfying than the things she could have settled with. But Jesus didn't have to talk to this woman. In fact, he almost received a little bit of flack for talking alone with the woman because no one asked him, what do you seek? But I'm sure it was a question on everyone's minds. Jesus took the time to meet with this woman, to meet where she was at, to understand her problem even though no one else wanted to even know her. Jesus had compassion on her. And not only after this did she not find a need to invest herself in her satisfaction, in her self-image for the serpent's case, or in her relationships, who she was currently with, and what was basically the only measure of honor identifiable to women in that day and age. Jesus gave her worth by saying, God loves you, and I can satisfy that need because I know you're thirsty. I know you have a desire to be wanted, to be loved, but you can only attract these men through physical means. And just like Steve Magnet's mustache was cut off so easily, Rarity took the time to replace him with something much more beautiful, even at the sacrifice of himself, in that Jesus was willing to even give up his life so that this woman wouldn't have to constantly search for something that never satisfied. No one else could have solved that problem for her. Maybe it would have grown back. We don't know. But what we do know is that Jesus took the time to be generous with this woman, and it meant more to her than anyone could ever have. Well, just like this. 5th event, Rainbow Dash. She was going to tie a down bridge, and being separated from the group, common military tactic, divide and conquer. The Shadow Bolts, mysterious, unconfirmed competitor to the Wonder Bolts, offered her a quick answer to her life dream, to her the goal that she had for her life since the day she was a filly, but at the cost of all of her friends. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 5 through 8, Jesus was put through a very similar temptation and gave quite the similar response, because Rainbow Dash would have to, for those of you who've seen later seasons, go through a lot of stress, a lot of unfortunate revealings of the true character of the people that she idolized, and as well as having to continue to train and push herself harder and harder to allow herself to have to suffer to earn the title that, for those of us who know, she hasn't even attained to yet. But, just like in this case, Rainbow Dash was offered to reject all the people that stood on her side, the ones that she was doing the very thing she set out to do before, and for a quick solution to her long-term goals, she's going to give a short-term answer. Well, Rainbow said no, because she would never go back on her friends. Her loyalty could not be questioned in that regard, even if it meant a quick solution. She knew that she would be a Wonderbolt someday. She was willing to work hard for it. But Jesus was offered a solution as well to his long-term goals. Jesus wanted his creation back, and he was prepared to die for it, to suffer for it, to carry the one thing that separated him and his beloved creation, his friends, his children, from him, was their natural separation from him, the sin in their heart and lives. So by taking the penalty on the cross, he would redeem creation back to him on the chance that they would receive it. Just like a gift, just like that woman at the well. You can't have your thirst satisfied unless you take a drink from the water that's given to you. You don't go to heaven by being religious. You go to heaven because you have a relationship with Jesus Christ. But Jesus would one day rule all of creation again. The devil is currently in charge of all creation because it was handed over to Adam and Eve, but they, in obeying Satan, handed that authority over to him. Thus, as we've discussed before, is the reason why creation's slowly falling apart. Jesus was given the same temptation that a lot of people are given, a lot of people face, and that's short-term answers to their long-term goals. He took him on a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and the devil said to him, "All this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all will be yours." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." Just like Rainbow Dash refused to sacrifice all of the people that she had, Jesus would not submit to Satan's authority, because even if he did gain all of creation back but lose you, if he didn't have to go to the cross to gain all of creation, all he had to do was say, "All right, Satan, you can take all of these people down to where you belong. Just make sure I don't have to go through that pain." A lot of us do this in relationships. A lot of us do this in our careers. Short-term answers that seem like what we're suffering through right now would be the only way. God has a better plan, even if it means pain, because Jesus would rise from that grave, and Jesus is coming back to rule this world. Problem is, just like Rainbow Dash, it's something that's still in process. Are you willing to get the long-term reward, or do you want a short-term solution? It all depends on who you're loyal to, God or Satan, because those are the only two powers that we ever answer to. A lot of people think you only answer to yourself, but sadly that's not the case. Continuing. Sixth event. Nightmare Moon versus Twilight Sparkle. Being separated from her friends and all of the elements in stones and relics surrounding her. She is doing everything in her power to overcome an alicorn princess with a bad attitude. And likewise, these relics are not giving her any chance. And even when they start to work, they just fall around Nightmare Moon's feet. And she even goes as far as breaking them. But it was only when those things were taken out of the way that she realized it wasn't in objects that the real powers had. It's in their hearts. The elements of harmony were not to be found in jewels, necklaces, and crowns, but it's in the heart and the lives of all the people who had stood by her side all this time. And that's how they defeated Nightmare Moon. They realized that they don't have to invest in the physical because they have something greater on their side. That the elements of harmony are inside all of them. Now, we've talked about this in the Elements of Harmony topical series, of course. But in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 12 through 17, Jesus, before going to the cross, takes the time to speak with his disciples and literally tells them outright, here's how you live a holy life. Here's how you obey all of the commandments. He just said, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No greater love. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, but because a servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit, and that that fruit should remain. And whoever asks of the Father in my name, he will give you. These things I command you, that you love one another. It's all manifested. The whole power of God, it's not in praying before a splinter of the true cross or one of the nails that pierced Jesus' wrists. It's not in relics. It's not through a priest. It's not through physical means. It's in your heart that you have the power of the Holy Spirit in all of your lives. By receiving him as your Lord and Savior, you don't have to go to the Temple of the Forgotten Sisters. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything, but just know that God loves you, and through his love others, because all of the commandments are fulfilled in just that. And sometimes it's when these things that distract us are taken out of the way that we're able to see them. In Isaiah chapter 4, Isaiah was living at a time where the king of Israel was a godly man. He had achieved a lot of military victory. He had achieved a lot of economic and political status and made Israel a Middle Eastern superpower, which is its greatest since the time of King Solomon and King David. And sometimes it's the good leaders that can end up distracting us from the one who's really on the throne. And it was when Uzziah died that seemed like a tragedy. He had no one to turn to but God. It's the same thing here. It's when the relics of the elements of harmony were broken that Twilight started to look to different sources than what she thought would be the solution. We aren't holy because we do all the right stuff. We aren't holy because, we were baptized as a kid. We aren't endowed. We aren't given the power of the tree of harmony because we wear these special necklaces. We are who we are because God said we are forgiven. We are holy because God said, I paid for that tab. If you trust in that, I guarantee you never lose it, because even discord could disrupt the elements of harmony. But they couldn't disrupt the character and heart of every single one of them. The truth is that God loves you. And if you receive him, it's finished. He made that statement and he meant it. And I want to finish with this, the seventh event, and the most spectacular out of all of them. Luna, once Nightmare Moon, is now defeated, broken, and vulnerable. She is completely at the mercy of a normal pony, even for an alicorn. Weakest point in her life. It would not have been hard, since Celestia actually showed up, to just banish her back to the moon again. Rightfully, it's what she deserves. She tried to take over the kingdom. The first time, she tried to take over the kingdom again. But now it was at this most vulnerable state, when she was completely at her mercy, that Celestia said, I missed you. Do you want to come back? Jesus was teaching in the temple one day. Or he was teaching in the area around the temple, rather. And the Pharisees and religious people wanted to trap him. Catch him up in his words, because they just didn't agree with the things that he was saying, so he wanted to discredit him. In catching a woman in the very act of adultery, the natural punishment was execution, stoning, death penalty. And since Rome was now in charge of Israel at the time, they did not have that right. But if Jesus were to say, no, don't kill her, be merciful and gracious, then naturally he would turn all of Israel against him, saying, you don't agree with God's law, what are you? But then likewise, if Jesus was to say, it is the fair thing to do, well then the Pharisees, the religious people, would go to the Roman authorities, report him, and then he'd be executed for good reason. Well, they thought they had trapped him. But when Jesus was confronted with this woman, you start to analyze this from like a few feet back and notice, I don't know much about the concept. I don't know much about the actual relations between a husband and wife, but generally that just means you have to have two people, doesn't it? Where was the guy? Why was only the girl being called to answer for a crime punishable by death? Do you think maybe she was being set up? Likewise, Jesus, when asked this question, just acted as if he didn't hear them, and he started writing in the sand. He didn't hear them. He wasn't listening. And they continued asking him, verse 7, if you want to follow along. This is in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. He was sitting down teaching the people, and then when they finally he had written all of this stuff down in the sand, he stood up and he said, he who is out without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And then he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest to the last. And Jesus was left all alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Now, it's really funny when you start to think, why do you think these guys suddenly felt they had obligations elsewhere when they had this ultimate zinger? Well, don't you think with the point that he brought up, likewise in later passages it said he would write them. He was there when all of us committed any sin or mistake that we've ever done in our lives. God sees in secret. So don't you think he's just sitting there kind of writing out, and then one of the guys who's telling him, what do you say? Should we stone her? Why are you writing my name? What did I... And he's just like, got his name written down. The first guy, oh, what's your name? Matthias? Okay, let's see. August 3rd at 2 in the morning. I remember I was supposed to bid on some sheep over here. And then Jesus, okay, move on to the next guy. And then they eventually all just left. All the people who wanted to accuse the woman anyway. And he was just left with her and him in that vulnerable state where that woman rightfully could have been stoned by the one person without there who had never done anything wrong. And Jesus said, has anyone condemned you? Anyone here without sin who has the right to punish you? And she said, no one, Lord. And so Jesus, being the only one who didn't have any sin in his life, who had the only right to fairly execute justice for what this woman had done. In fact, what really wasn't her fault. Jesus said, full of compassion, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Note, he wasn't excusing the thing that she did, but he's saying, I'm not willing to punish you. In fact, I'm about to go deal with it soon. I just want to ask that you don't do it again. Or at least, stop heading that direction. Start living a new life. Don't let these things catch up or control you again. Now note, if Luna had rebelled again, Celestia would have been any grounds to banish her, or worse. But likewise, Luna knew a good deal when she had it after 1,000 years in isolation. She had not only gotten the rightful punishment, but Celestia, when, same crime, same deed, full of grace and compassion, just like Jesus said, You want to come home? The amazing thing is Jesus is offering you the same thing. We deserve separation from God. It's not that we do these things and it just makes God so angry he has to kill us. No, God is life. And if you separate yourself from his plan, if you move yourself away from him and where he is, the absence of life is death. The absence of light is darkness. But God is saying, I dealt with all of that. Are you ready to come back home? It's all coming down to whether you're willing to say, just like Luna, I'm so sorry. Can you please forgive me? It's that simple. Just like Luna was restored not only to the same position that she had and was welcomed into the lives back of her nation and of her ponies, with some adjustment, of course. There's always going to be that time for Christians where we're sort of getting used to the new idea of a new life and need to learn new ways of doing things. We'll be talking about that in the Luna Eclipsed episode. But just remember that God is the only one who has the authority to condemn you. And note, not religious people, not people who say, I'm a representative of God. Only God has the right to judge you. And he will, if you don't accept his forgiveness. And I hope and I pray anyone hearing this message and anyone who enjoys this show can see that the greatest story ever told is always pointing back to that same opportunity and saying, we have an opportunity for a new life. We have a new opportunity in what we were once called enemies of Equestria. We can now be remade into princesses and princes of the kingdom again, sons of the king, because Jesus doesn't call us servants, even though we're called to be that. He calls us friends. In the book of Revelation, chapter 21, it says, I will be his God, and he shall be my son. I will give the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. And again at the chapter 22, some of the very last verses of the Bible, the Spirit and the bride say, come. Let him who thirsts come. Let him who desires, let him take the water of life freely. If you want a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, all you have to do is say, I'm sorry for throwing in my lot with Nightmare Moon, with corrupting the good plan that you had for my life, and for coming back to you. Thank you for your time, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this episode review. If you have questions, do not hesitate to put them in the comments below. And I thank you for your time and hope you come back for more in the near future.